As activists and community members rally against the release of Jason Van Dyke, Illinois' two U.S. senators are pressing the Justice Department on a federal civil rights investigation into the former Chicago police officer. Senators Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth say the facts of the case are, quote, shocking and upsetting, and are asking the Attorney General for an update into the probe. It comes amid a busy time in Washington, with President Biden gearing up to nominate a new Supreme Court justice and fears over Russian military action in Ukraine. Joining us to discuss all those issues and more is Senator Tammy Duckworth. Senator, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be on. Thank you.
So, have you received any response from the Justice Department since your letter to the Attorney General this week?
I have not received a response, and Dick had not indicated to me whether or not he'd received a response. It's our joint letter, but it's a really serious issue, and we're both extremely concerned.
Based on your knowledge of the case, which have been obviously widely reported, do the facts support charging Jason Van Dyke with a federal crime?
Well, that's the problem. We know that there was an investigation done, but frankly, there's not been any release of this information, and that's why we wrote the letter that we did, and we're just basically saying, look, the U.S. Department of Justice needs to share an update on their investigation into Laquan McDonald's murder 7 years ago. And the DOJ so far has declined to provide any information on the status of this investigation. I think, and I know Chicagoans deserve answers, and I think the DOJ needs to examine and pursue any well-founded civil rights violations that may have happened. But the problem is we don't know what all the facts are because DOJ has not shared that information with us.
So, shifting to foreign affairs a bit, Russia has moved an estimated 100,000 troops to its border with Ukraine. We know there are furious diplomatic efforts underway to defuse that situation. Here's some of what Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said about Russian President Vladimir Putin yesterday.
We still don't believe he's made a decision to further invade Ukraine. And if he does further invade Ukraine, obviously there's going to be consequences for that, but he has many options and capabilities available to him as to how he might do that. And we simply don't know. We want to make sure that he knows any move on NATO is going to be resisted.
Senator, are we able to prevent? Is there a chance to prevent a war here?
Well, I think there is a chance to prevent a war, and that's why negotiations are ongoing. But it is really important to make it clear to Vladimir Putin that there will be consequences should he decide to invade Ukraine. He can invade in many different ways. He could try to seize just Kyiv, the capital. He could try to do a wholesale invasion. Whatever it is, none of it is acceptable, and that NATO is united to oppose him, and that we in the U.S. Congress, for sure, are united to impose sanctions should that need to happen.
If Russia does invade Ukraine, should the U.S. take military action?
Well, we're going to have to take some sort of action, not necessarily with Ukraine, but remember that we're party to the NATO alliance, and Article 5 means that all of their alliance says that all NATO countries must support each other. So if Russia invades Ukraine, the first nation, a NATO nation in the front lines of that would be Poland, which is an Article 5 NATO member. And so we will have to have U.S. troops in places, and we already have moved some into places like Belarus, Poland, and be there to help protect NATO. So we're going to have military action. Whether or not we go into Ukraine itself is something that we're going to have to look at. But for sure, we're going to be there in support of our allies like Poland.
So the Kremlin has reportedly, though, taken significant steps to insulate itself against any economic sanctions. Do you think there is still a way to effectively sanction Russia in case of instead of an invasion?
Oh, very much so. And we've also made it clear to Germany that should Russia invade, then definitely the Nord Stream pipeline needs to be shut off. Already that process has been delayed, but Russia is not in an economic position that is a very healthy one right now already. And economic sanctions, especially if it is one that is upheld across NATO, can really significantly negatively affect Russia.
So the Biden administration, we know, is in the process of selecting a Supreme Court nominee now that Justice Breyer has announced his plans to retire. What are you hoping to see from the president's nominee?
I think any one of the front runners who's been mentioned would be great. I actually just spoke with Vice President Harris about less than an hour ago. She called to get my opinion on it. I said, listen, any of the front runners whose names you've seen have been great. I, of course, put in my 2 cents worth for Justice Candace Jackson Akiwumi, our hometown girl,
here in Chicago.
Justice here in Chicago. And so I said she would be great, but any one of those justices would be great. I think the president's commitment to placing a Black woman on the Supreme Court, it's long overdue. And I'm so glad that he's made that commitment.
So, Senator, in a 50-50 Senate, the Democrats can't afford to lose any votes. Do you foresee any difficulty with getting a nominee confirmed?
Well, I think that we'll have a better shot if we have a nominee who's already been confirmed by this same Senate. Justice Akiwumi is one of those justices who has been confirmed by this very Senate. And there are multiple names among the front runners who've been confirmed with Republican votes by Republican senators who are still in the Senate. So I do think that there is a path forward. I'm really pleased to see that both Dick Durbin, who's our chair of the Judiciary Committee, and his ranking member, Chuck Grassley, have been meeting with the president on this.
And of course, when you say confirmed, you mean for their sitting benches, their current benches in federal circuit courts across the country.
Yes.
You appeared virtually at a rally this week speaking out against anti-Asian American hate crimes, which have risen dramatically in the last 2 years. You've also worked on legislation on this issue signed into law last year. What more needs to be done to combat this problem?
Well, we have to implement some of the portions of the law that was signed into law this year to include training of police officers and training of police forces to recognize violence against Asian Americans. A lot of times what happens is that when there's violence against Asian Americans, it's not reported as a race crime, but simply as a burglary or something like that, but not as a hate crime. So we have to teach people to recognize that if somebody is picked to be the victim because they're Asian, then that is a hate crime. And we really do have to elevate and the issue and make sure that people know that this is a real problem, because people really don't think of Asian Americans as often being the victims of these crimes. Yet it's Asian women, and in particular elderly Asian women, who have really been targeted over these past years, and especially within this past year.
Now, the Army Corps of Engineers just budgeted more than $200 million for the Waterway barrier in Illinois to keep invasive carp out of the Great Lakes. Some regional elected officials, including Governor Pritzker, want the federal government to pay for the full project rather than having Illinois chip in part of the cost. Do you think that's a possibility?
I'm going to try very hard to make it a possibility. I'm very pleased that after lots of pressure, the Army Corps of Engineers did come through with this money, and that was thanks in part to the bipartisan infrastructure deal, but also because I put a lot of pressure on them. This past year, I became chairwoman of the Air-Land Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee, and that committee is in charge of all of the Army. So I was able to put some pressure on them. I'm glad we're going to get the project moving, but we'll do everything that we can, and I will do everything that I can to try to make sure that the state is reimbursed as much as possible. This is not just an Illinois issue. This is a regional issue. We're keeping these fish from getting into the Great Lakes, which is going to cost tens of billions of dollars in damage to the environment, as well as to commercial fishing and outdoor recreation across not just all the many states on the Great Lakes, but also 2 provinces in Canada. So this, I think, is far greater than just Illinois, and Illinois should not be stuck footing the bill by itself.
The president recently signed an executive order making sexual harassment a distinct crime in the military under its Uniform Code of Justice. What work still needs to be done to ensure that harassment and abuse are not tolerated in the military?
Well, I think that we need to implement the law. I voted for that piece of legislation and, in fact, helped to craft it to make sure that we don't tolerate sexual harassment and retaliation within the military. The key thing that happened here is that we're moving the investigation and prosecution of these crimes out of the chain of command, something that advocates have been advocating for a very long time. But we have to go back, and this is a maintenance issue. This is something that we have to continually be working on so that when we bring in new recruits into the military, from day one, that they are not subject to sexual harassment. And we're going to provide a lot of oversight on this. There's a bipartisan group of female senators in particular that are watching this in the Senate. I partner with Joni Ernst, who's the Republican she's also an Army veteran like me, and we work very closely on this.
Okay. Senator Tammy Duckworth there in Washington, D.C., thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.